Hello! I recently wrapped up the complete Ruby on Rails developer course on Udemy and wanted to share some thoughts about it with you. At a high level, there's no prior knowledge needed going into the course, either for Ruby or Rails or really any web app development at all. With that said, I would recommend you have at least a basic knowledge of HTML, CSS, and at least have had some exposure to JavaScript, though I will say I have no professional outline in JavaScript and I was able to get through this just fine. That said, if you're looking to build on top of this at a later time, it's probably a useful skill to have. The course will cover Ruby basics, the MVC framework of a Rails project, so you don't need to necessarily know what that is going into it, and the early projects in the course will go step by step through every part of building out a Rails app by hand, and then eventually we'll roll into more automated commands to build things out like models, controllers, and views. There are multiple projects you'll work on through the course. To go over those very quickly, at least for the ones that I think are most valuable. The first project is building out a multi-user blogging system. So you're going to do a homegrown authentication system for that, so user signups, profile management, and the like, as well as doing dynamic content rendering depending on the logged in user, whether they're a normal user, an admin user, whether or not they can edit or delete certain articles, as well as the relationships between users and articles. The next project is a real-time chat room, and that's going to be using WebSockets and JavaScript to handle real-time communication and UI updates. Next up is a social stock tracking application, which starts to implement API integrations with third-party services. So you'll learn about encrypted credentials, how to manage those, what that looks like in a production deployment as well, where you have to handle those somewhat differently. And it also gives you the ability to add and follow other users to see their portfolios as well, in addition to the ability to add your own stocks to your own portfolio. And then, for what I deem sort of the end of the real value prop here, there's an application to do photo management. So that's handling integration with somewhat specific services. So using SendGrid to send out email confirmations, using Stripe to handle credit card payments, though I will note that the API it's using is deprecated, so you may have to do some extra work there. And then last but not least, it also introduces the ability to upload files to an application rather than just retrieve content. So let's dive into the projects here. The first one we're going to take a look at is the blog project, so called Alpha Blog is the project name. I've just got it locally as a repository here, so we'll go ahead and start the server up. So Rails S, it's going to run on localhost 3000. You'll see that be in common for pretty much all of them. This project's using Rails 6 and Bootstrap for UI formatting, I guess, probably the easiest way to put it. One of the other features this has is multiple user types. So if we take a look here, let's hop into my Rails console and take a look at all the users we have. You can see one of the attributes here is admin. So we do have an admin user here. So if we said user equals user.last, user.admin, we can see that they are an admin in fact, which is great. So when we go to log in, you'll see some differences between the UI functionality for that user versus some of the other ones. So hopping over to the web, let's reload this and see if we can get in. Cool, there we go. So we can get a list of all the accounts that we have, so the bloggers. We can see a listing of all the articles, including some interesting things that are in here for testing. Giving a list of all the categories, so different articles can relate to different categories. And then, of course, we can log in or sign up, and this is all homegrown, whereas later projects will wind up using something like Devise for it. So let's log in as our test user, so test@example.com, and let's see if I can remember the password. Good, I did. So what we can see here, it'll take us to our own page here, so the test user, and we can see all of our articles. We can view them, we can edit them, we can add new features to it. Updating article, we can update it, and there we go. Everything's there, and we have our new categories for the article. And we can also delete articles from here. So if we go into looking at all articles, actually articles in general here, you can see we now have the option to create an article, which is great. And if we go into all articles, we can see that there's going to be a difference here between articles that we've created and that other users have created. So you can see, for example, from admin and user 1, we can only view articles. But if we go back to ones created by our test user, we have access to everything here. We can also go in and edit our profile through here, delete the account, update everything that has to do with it. So username, so that's what shows up for the articles, email address on file, and the password. So you'll notice, though, we can't create categories, and we also, as I said, can't delete other users' content. So if we log out here and come back in as our admin user, which hopefully I remember the password for, there we go. Come in as our admin user, you can see we're labeled as an admin up at the top. We also have the ability to create new categories now, which is good. And if we go in to articles, we can modify everything. So you see we're logged in as admin, but we can edit users from test. We can edit our own articles. We can edit them from, I think I've got some articles from user 1. We can do all sorts of management through that. So, and we can also edit categories now. You see we have this edit category name. So that's sort of the extent of what we have here. We can also edit other user profiles, not just our own at this point. So that's the extent of the first project. Really, it's there to give you an overview of all the basics, relationships between objects, and sort of doing a homegrown version of an authentication system, whereas later projects are going to use pre-made stuff like Devise to do that for you, which is a significant time saver, but this gives you the basics for it and starts to go into some command line troubleshooting and development work through the Rails console. The next project we're going to look at is the real-time chat room messaging service, which is called Message Me for this. So similarly, we're going to start this one up. You'll be able to see this one's actually running on Rails 5, just sort of the age of the course, but it gives you a basis over what some of the differences are going to be in terms of actual code layout and how to actually manage multiple Rails versions on your development environment, as well as in production, depending on what service you're using. So don't know what that's from. I think I misclicked something. Oh, this tried to refresh an old URL. So let's go back to the main page of the browser. But what we're going to do here is you can see we're using a different version of Ruby and everything here. So we will, actually we don't need to do anything for the console for this one. So let's hop over to the web. So we're already logged in here. We're in as user 1, I believe. This is really the extent of the functionality. We can hop through to the chat room. A lot of the UI stuff is not covered, but it's things you can integrate down the road. The focus on this, again, is Rails 5. It's using semantic UI for the layouts, so just a different framework that you can start to get familiar with. And then we can start writing things in here. Look, it works. We get real-time updates. And just for simplicity of recording, you can take my word for it, but if you have multiple browsers open with multiple different users logged in, you'll see everything update in real time. To prevent things from really blowing up, all of this only displays, I think, the last 20 messages or 30 messages, which is something you'll implement during the course, as well as the dynamic scrolling and everything for this. So good basics to start to understand that, how WebSockets work, and how to configure Action Cable, which seems to be a relatively common thing to use for it. Cool. And the last one we're going to take a look at here is going to be the finance tracker application. So again, we'll start this one up with Rails S. See, this one's running back on Rails 6. This one's also going to be using Bootcamp again for UI layouts. Seems to be a favorite from the instructor, and certainly you'll get real familiar with it because you're going to use it a lot through the Alpha Blog project as well. And I will note this is the last one we're going to take a look at. The last project has a few things that just really don't work currently, unfortunately. So really the Stripe integration and whatnot. So not the best to demo, but it is an interesting thing to at least go through and play around with, even if it's not actually completable based on the course material. So looping back to the finance tracker here, let's pop over to our web view. The first thing you're going to see is we're using Devise for all of our authentication. We're also handling user sessions a fair bit more gracefully than we may have been in the past. Again, a lot of that is coming for free from Devise, which is great. And it also starts to take a look at extending things out. So if we log in here, let's see if I can remember my credentials. Cool. So we're in. If we take a look at our profile here, what we're going to do normally for Devise, we're just going to get email, password, and then we get the password confirmation, and most of this for free. So one of the things this is going to do is give you the ability to extend a user out to have multiple new profile values. So if we take a look at my portfolio here, you can see we're tracking a couple stocks. We can add them, we can remove them. Let's pull off Microsoft, for example. MSFT, we can search for new ones, shows up with the price, and we can add it to portfolio. One thing to note is that this is using cached prices for things. If you hit something new, it'll give you a new value, but otherwise it's going to pull it from the database. It's not intended to actually be used in a useful tracking setup like this. You'd want to modify it to do real-time pulls every time, but this is sort of to show database interactions versus API calls when you want to use cached information for it. The other feature from this is we can actually go through, we can add friends, we can search for other users. So you can see here I've got multiple users added as friends. We will pull out the fourth user and let's search for them again. We can jump through to their profile. We can see they're not tracking any stocks, so why would we care about following them? But if we go over to this user, we can see they are tracking some stocks here. And from that page, we can actually add them to our profile. One of the other things that this has is the ability to dynamically, or I should say not dynamically, to limit the number of stocks you're following, as well as show you if you're already following things. So for example, here with Tesla, we're already following it, so we don't need an option to follow it again. We're already friends with this user, so we don't need an option to add them as friends. And we're already tracking 10 stocks, which is the limit we've added here. So just another condition that we want to prevent people from adding more than that. For thoughts on the individual projects, the blog is a fantastic introduction into Rails, building on top of what you'll get in the very early sections, going through Ruby basics and an outline of a Rails application framework. It's going to give you stuff that's applicable to all of the remaining projects, and realistically, even working with Rails apps on a regular basis, a great basis to work off of those. And it really does go step by step through absolutely everything. So if you do have prior experience, you may find it a little basic, but if you're coming in fresh, it really lays it all out for you. The chat room application is also a really good one. It gives you an introduction into WebSockets and starting to work with additional gems outside of just layout stuff like Bootstrap and the associated bits there, as well as handling production deployments using different gems for production versus test. So using Redis in production versus just using Postgres locally. The stock app also, I'd say, is a high value one. That goes through extending out third-party gems, so you're going to be building things on top of Devise for authentication, as well as giving you an introduction into handling encrypted credentials, as I mentioned. From that point onwards, I think the value starts to go down a little bit, but you've really gotten the bulk of the basics at that point, which I think is really the main goal of this, in my opinion. So the photo management app is starting to build on top of the other sections. So this is going to start looking at specific third-party implementations, so Stripe, SendGrid, and the like, and start to get a little more JavaScript focused for it. Not necessarily from a development perspective, meaning you won't learn how to build the JavaScript stuff, but it does feature somewhat prominently. It'll also start to go into automated creation of different parts of the Rails framework. So you basically using a single command to build out controllers rather than having to do it all by hand. Once that's done, you get to the bonus project, which is a project management application. And then there's another sort of rehash of an early project using materialized CSS instead of Bootstrap or Semantic. And I think for both of those, the value is reasonably low. So if you're going through and you're pressed for time, that's probably 11 hours of the course you can take off right there. Effectively, it's going through and tying a bunch of the concepts together into a single application. So frankly, there's a lot of repeated effort there, seemingly. So if you're looking to go into purely a development perspective from this, I suspect that it's probably quite valuable because repetition is always very useful. But if you're looking to just pull the basics of managing and troubleshooting a Rails app, there's probably limited value there. One note on the course is that it does come with virtually no support at all. It looks like earlier on, at least a few years ago, the course developer and the TA for the course were quite involved, but that does seem to have taken a sharp turn over the past few years, with virtually all assistance in the course now coming from other people who are going through the course at that time. In a lot of cases, that leads to either outdated information or questions that never get answered, unfortunately. With that said, if you can get the course on discount, it usually seems to be up for about $20. That's a fantastic value. You'll absolutely get your money's worth for it, and realistically, that's going to work out to between 40 and 50 hours, most likely, of content when you include your own sort of project on top of the lecture work. I'd say focus on sections 1 through 9 of the course for the most value. So that's all the Ruby basics, the Rails basics, and then going through all the way to the stock app, so the finance tracker app, I believe it's called. And then you can start dabbling with the photo management app, which currently is section 10. The only other piece of advice I'd give is if you're going through this, try to use a local Rails environment for it. So run Rails locally on your machine rather than using a service like Cloud9. You'll simplify some things and also get a lot more exposure to other things like managing multiple Ruby versions, Rails versions, and the like on your local machine.